I know it's late in the day. I really appreciate all of you who've stayed along at this time of the day to hear me speak. Also, thank you to EFICode. As you were just saying, our interaction started with a podcast, the Sona podcast, which I've been on a couple of times. And I think every time we have a conversation, the conversations actually last a lot longer than the podcast and the bit that you get to see of it or hear of it. And it's been really informative and interesting for me. I watched the end of the last talk, and I'm a little bit concerned that you're going from developer joy to developer gloom at this time of day. Sorry about that. Will AI destroy open source software? So what do you reckon? Hands up if you think it's going to destroy it. 1, 2, interesting, women, both women. So 2 people think it will be destroyed, and they're both female. And I assume the rest of you think it's great. Yeah? Okay. So I often get asked how I ended up in open source. I used to be a lawyer, and I was a lawyer for 25 years. And 16 years ago, almost exactly, I joined the motley crew at Canonical. I was employee 185, and I joined to be the general counsel, so the head lawyer, and I worked globally in open source. And I was actually only meant to be there 3 months, and then I was supposed to go and join Amazon. And it didn't happen because I joined Canonical, and I completely fell in love with open source, which wasn't in anybody's projection of where my career was going. And I fell in love with the values, I fell in love with the idea of collaboration, of contribution, just the ecosystem and what was going on in it at the time. It was really groundbreaking and exciting, as it still is today. And my career evolved after 5 years there. So I've done various different things along the way. But what I found was that love for the community and the engagement with the community led me to be on a number of different boards. I think my favorite was probably the UN and helping with things like building a blockchain for the land registry in Afghanistan post-war that was open source. And today I sit on a number of boards, things like the Open Standards Board, which is a government appointment. I'm on a lot of lists these days, which is great because it means open source is being recognized. And then for my sins, I have ADHD, which I talk about quite a lot, which means that I do things like lose clickers when I'm presenting. But I edited a book, and I'm quite proud of this because it's 640 pages long, and I have read that from beginning to end 4 times. And it's written by 26 different lawyers who are among the leading lawyers globally in open source software. We also cover open hardware and open data, but in less depth. And bizarrely, when we launched the book about 18 months ago, it went viral on the Chinese internet. So I spend a lot of my time these days talking, traveling the world talking. I'm going to China for the first time, visa permitting, in a couple of weeks. And there's a community there who've been translating the book into Mandarin, who I'm going to get to meet for the first time. And I've mentioned that I got into open source through Canonical. And of course, that led to a lot of connections in the UK. You probably saw in the last couple of weeks, Canonical celebrating its 20th birthday. And there's an ecosystem of people that I met through Canonical 16 years ago who are part of this UK contributing ecosystem to open source. And about 4.5 years ago, somebody approached me to build OpenUK, and I said no. I said no because I'm part of a global tech sector. I'm part of a globally contributing cross-geopolitical shift community. And I didn't care about the UK, frankly. So I didn't see that as my future. And I hadn't worked really in the UK since 2000. In 5 years at Canonical, I did 2 deals in Europe, one in Luxembourg and one in the UK, or a series really, with one company in the UK who are represented in the room today, but shall remain nameless. And what I realized was there was a lot going on in open source. It was suddenly winning. Starting at Canonical, we'd been banging on doors and not getting through the risk people, not getting through the gatekeepers, so open source wasn't being adopted in the enterprise. And I'll talk a little bit about how that shifted in a minute. But what I saw was things changing, and changing in particular in Europe, where they were really starting to focus on open source. As it became more successful, the policymakers, the regulators were looking more and more at it. And I was worried that with Brexit, we would end up in a situation where here in the UK, having been the leader, we were going to fall behind. So I thought it was worth a punt, but only if I could do it the way I wanted to do it. And the way I wanted to build this organization was to focus on people and to let the companies follow that. And you'll see if you look at OpenUK that we're built up of around 400 people. These are roughly up to date, but not entirely, and you might recognize 1 or 2 people in the room in these slides. We are a community-led organization. We're built on open source principles, but we work in a slightly different way. And the way we work, I think, is that we're very different from foundations. We bring in the people and we rely on the company's following. And by bringing in the people, you bring in the people across open source software, open hardware, open data. So from day one, we focused not on open source software, but open technology as a landscape. And that's important when we start to talk about AI and what AI openness means and the impact that it's going to have on open source software. So we're entirely reliant on goodwill and sponsorship from our many sponsors. And you'll see as time's gone by, those have increased. As we've built out the organization, we focus on belonging. And that belonging has brought people from a very diverse community into our organization. And we work on 3 pillars. We work on community, legal and policy, and learning. And I think we're probably the only organization that has built a large community that doesn't have code at its center. Generally, people come together and collaborate and work as communities because they have a deliverable. You know, we have many deliverables, but they're not code. And for some of the engineers, that's taken a shift in thinking to be able to collaborate and help us to deliver the outputs around legal and policy. But what it does do is it convenes a conversation. And it convenes a conversation here in the UK and globally, because as you saw, our mission, our purpose is UK leadership and global collaboration. And as a small organization, we're able to lead. We're able to think about how open source generates value ahead of others shifting towards that. We're able to do difficult conversations about sustainability, difficult conversations about AI ahead of the curve because we have different stakeholders and vested interests. But what we do is we pull that community together to give them a voice. And we do that through things like awards, honours lists. And we give them the voice through responding to legislation and setting the agenda on policy. Back in 2021, coming out of lockdown, we had one of the biggest events at COP26. This is the venue we were in. It was quite phenomenal. When you look at that, you'd expect it to be a couple of thousand people. It was a couple of hundred people, and at that time, that seemed absolutely huge, having been locked up for a couple of years. But we delivered at that a blueprint on data centers, and we thought about how you make data centers more sustainable through software, hardware, data being opened up. Last year, we created a second blueprint on EV charging. If you're interested in the data center piece, next week at KubeCon there's a hackathon, and that hackathon has 4 challenges that OpenUK has created for them that focus on the data centers and the gaps. So although we're not a code-holding organization, it's possible for us to drive some of the innovation. And then we do reporting. When we talk to our audience internally and the sort of marketplace, we find that the reporting is one of the key things that people are interested in. And that shifted last year. It shifted to us starting to talk about AI. Now, for me, I am not an AI expert, right? Let's be really clear about this. I have avoided conversations on security and AI for years because you have to really know what you're talking about. I'm not an AI expert. However, I know a bit about open source, and I know how open source fits into it, in my view at least. And there's been no choice. Last year, things shifted, and I'm going to take you through my last 12 months in AI in just a second. One of the critical things you'll see that we delivered at our conference is the Open Manifesto. And for all of you, for everybody in the UK who is looking towards an election this year, getting our politicians to understand how technology really works and the importance of the opens is going to be critical as the government changes, however it changes, and as the public sector shifts to follow that. So we have 3 specific asks, and we're going to be asking people to sign up to this individually and to have companies sign up to this and support it to give it weight with government. And we're looking at building out skills, something that's absolutely missing in open source as a future generation with the right skills, but that offers a huge opportunity to us here in the UK. It offers an opportunity for us to teach people actual hands-on practical skills that they don't get from being taught to code so that they can contribute to open source projects and help those projects have longevity, but also to build and fill the skills gap in the UK. We're looking at the public sector because the pace of adoption, as I'm going to talk to you about, hasn't been matched by a pace of understanding in open source, which is a huge problem. And of course, AI openness, the main thing today. And we do that partly through learning, which is our 3rd pillar at OpenUK, and there's loads of stuff around learning. and through things like our conferences. And our conference is a little bit different, as anybody in the room who was there will know. We try to be at the intersection of that law, policy, engineering, and business. So we bring together a really mixed group of people to have conversations that the engineers and business people often don't hear. And they often don't hear them because they're policy focused, because they're focused on licensing, because they're focused on legal issues, but things that you actually need to have a base knowledge in, as well as your technical stuff. And one of the things you'll see both in OpenUK and in the conferences is that we've created a really diverse group of people, and they're visibly and invisibly diverse. So if you look at the stats that we have across the conferences, I suspect they'll be unique in UK tech, but also in open source. So into what we really want to talk about today, open source, and is it going to be destroyed by AI? So what is open source? Well, I think your answer probably depends on how you got into it, right? I will say as a sort of disclaimer, it is not a business model, and anybody who thinks it is going to get into trouble. It's a community movement, it's a software methodology, it's many things to different people, and your view on it, your lens on it will probably come from your entry point. You know, mine was in Canonical, working in it as a business. I understand business models fairly well. It's something I'm really interested in. For those who came into it collaborating and contributing through their companies, they'll view it that way. For those who've been individual community contributors, you'll view it that way. What it technically is, if we go back to a lawyer's definition, is code that's publicly shared, the source is made available, people can work on that, they can modify it, they can contribute to it, and it's shared under a license. So in effect, if you put it on GitHub and you put an open source license on it, it's open source, right? Now, we all know that there's more to it than that. There's community, there's contribution, there's documentation, there's the good governance, the practicalities of it, the technical hygiene. But at its essence, it's this licensing model. And that licensing model ties back to the open source definition. Now, I could joke with you and say, let's recite this together. And I could do the same in a room full of lawyers, and nobody, not even Bruce Perens, who wrote the thing, can do it, right? None of us know it. But we have a reassurance of the open source initiative who checks that licenses match this, and then we can use OSI-approved licenses and be sure we meet the definition. Now, really boring lawyer stuff, but why do we care? Well, for me, 5 and 6 are why we care, and fortunately, they're the shortest ones. And what they mean is that there's a free flow. At its heart, at the heart of open source, anybody can use the code for any purpose, without restriction, without commercial restriction, without restrictions that come out of your ethics and morals. We don't make judgment. And that free flow allows everybody to rely that nobody can control the ecosystem, but also that anybody can use the code. You don't have to worry about payment generally. Very rare for anything to kick in around payment. You can use it. You don't have to worry about how you're using it, whether it matches the original creator's morals and ethics. And that's really important. That free flow is what's allowed adoption to get to the scale that it has today. Now, that scale of adoption, in the report last year, I've not read this year's, to my shame, which came out about a week ago, but in the report last year from Sonotype, I think, it says that 96% of all stacks have open source dependencies. You all know what that means. 76% of the stacks are open source. That's a big shift. When I was at Canonical, I told you already, we were blocked. We had these gatekeepers who wouldn't let us through the gates. And they were risk professionals who didn't understand the software. And they were legal, they were procurement, they were finance. And they're kind of irrelevant these days. They're irrelevant because of Git. They're irrelevant because of the shift in the role of the developers and engineers and companies. So what we see is with digitalization, engineers and developers have a much different role. They're decision makers. And with having GitHub, GitLab, Launchpad, the other repos, the use of Git has allowed that collaborative working, that easy access to code that allows engineers to bring it into their organization at a different level in the chain. They don't have to go through those gatekeepers. And what that means is we see mass adoption of open source today, which we struggled with before. If you're in a company, the smart way to manage your risk is to have moved it from contracts to policies and processes and procedures. Whether you've done that or not is another thing, because the pace of adoption and the pace of understanding haven't been matched. And we couldn't have imagined the scale. You know, back in my Canonical days, we could not have imagined that 96% of a stack would have dependencies. That was just way beyond our wildest dreams. Now, back in those days, I used to know a lot of jokes about open source. And I don't know any now because the punchline was always Microsoft, whatever the joke was. And things have changed, right? This is my mate Steve Wally at the Open Source Summit that Linux Foundation had in Edinburgh in 2018. And he's talking about why Microsoft shifted, what has taken them on this journey. And he talks about three things. He talks about all developers who've learned to code in the last roughly 20 years have learned to do so with open source methodologies, to collaborate, to stand on the shoulders of giants, to recycle and reuse. It's a competitive market with digitalization, and if you want to hire those developers, you have to let them do open source. He talks about the fact that innovation today is so different and that so much of it comes from open source, and often it's only available open source, at least initially. And what that means is that his customers were coming to him, Microsoft's customers were coming and specifically asking for open source products, which meant they had to stock them. They had to make them available to their customers. And then the third thing is the cloud. And the cloud is hugely significant because when we look at the public cloud, what we see is infrastructure shifting to being almost entirely built on open source. And that's absolutely critical because it means that every enterprise, the public sector, relies on open source. Now, I mentioned that the UK was world leading. 12 years ago, it came out with its first open source first policy. The problem is we don't really have teeth for that. We don't have the things that back it up. And that's the kind of thing that OpenUK is working on today. But what you've got is a public sector and a private sector that are almost entirely dependent on this open source software, which means they're entirely dependent on the knowledge of that free flow working, and open source being what it says on the tin, the OSD being complied with and OSI approved licenses. So we've won, right? Battle over. Except, is it the battle we've won? Is it a war we've won? What have we won? And that's the issue. I don't think any of us know yet. What we know is that we're at a point in history where open source is prevalent. But how do we keep that? How do we allow the pace of understanding to move fast enough that we know it will have a secure future? And how is that going to be impacted, or is it being impacted by AI? So actually, I'll just pause there. Last July, we launched our first report. And we did it with Jimmy Wales, who was absolutely hilarious and said only 8 companies in the world can comply with the AI Act, I quote, and we'll come to that in a second. We really look into, in last July, the state of the market. We didn't mean to do that. AI was going to be a topic added to our economic report. It was going to be 6 pages long, not 60 pages long as it ended up being. And we didn't really have a choice because so much happened last year. And in just a couple of minutes, I'm going to take you through my 12 months of AI. But before I get there, AI is impacting open source on a hands-on, day-to-day level. So you all know that there's Copilot litigation. You all know that there's litigation left, right, and center around copyright and open source. Different countries are going to decide that in different ways. That's going to be very relevant to all of us. We care about, in principle, how the licenses are followed. We care about the outputs being good outputs, that they respect the license requirements, things like attribution, and we're not sure where that's going to go. So that could have a detrimental and undermining effect on open source. We also, I think, universally care about maintainers, people who are doing their best to maintain projects, often being requested to maintain them in a way that would match commercial SLAs, although they're doing it in their spare time. Those people are being put under increased pressure because they're now receiving contributions which are AI generated. And there's a question there about how that's going to impact the quality of the code and the extra work and extra burden that's going to put on them. So there are practical day-to-day things that we're going to have to think about as we see Gen AI and these tools that are often really helpful day-to-day also have an impact on the ecosystem. At the same time, we get into FUD. Now, anybody who's been around open source for any length of time is familiar with FUD, fear, uncertainty, and doubt. In my canonical days, we used to say it was something Microsoft spread. So fear, uncertainty, and doubt, something that's very easy in open source because we have this complex open source definition. Many people don't understand it. We have a licensing regime that's very legalistic to most engineers, and something that, I learned it from engineers, to be quite honest, but something that a lot of people just don't think about and don't look at. So it's very easy to confuse. It's very easy to pass something off as being open source. I believe earlier today you talked about license shift, license change, probably about things like doubling down on open when you mean that you're not doubling doubling down on open, but you're moving away from open source licensing to something with a restriction. In that case, what's happening with people like Elastic, recently, our open source poster child HashiCorp moved away from open source. What you're seeing there is a restriction being added. And that restriction, whether it's commercial or whether it's ethical, interrupts the free flow. And that's exactly the problem we have with AI. So this time last year, people like Matt Barker, who's our entrepreneur in residence at OpenUK, were coming up to me really excited last March, saying, oh, have you seen what OpenAI is doing? And I'm like, OpenAI? Okay, that must be an open source company. I'm going to go and look into that. And of course, I was disappointed. There's nothing open about OpenAI, as we all know today. But ChatGPT 4 shifted the landscape. It created something where people were starting to say, I'm now getting use out of AI, because AI has been one of those things that's been around for years, right? We've all seen it. We've all thought, is this the next blockchain or is it the next internet? Who knows? We look at HAL and a space odyssey and worry about it taking over our lives. But what we're actually looking at with generative AI is something very different, right? It's a tool. It's a neurolinguistic tool that we can benefit from, we think. We see ChatGPT 4 come out with non-open AI, and then we see Elon Musk starting to talk about opening up AI and how he was involved in the setup of it and claiming that it was always intended to be truly open. There were even rumors last year that ChatGPT was going to be opened up, which obviously didn't happen. Altman didn't do that. But what we do see around end of March last year is Llama, the first Llama, being shared by Meta on a restricted license, restricted to research. So that license was really for researchers and academics to use and wasn't intended to be an open source license. It's not one that meets the open source definition. And when Llama was leaked, what we see is an opportunity without a correct licensing regime for the community to start to collaborate. And the importance of that is the cost. So the cost of an LLM is so huge in terms of financials, in terms of resource, in terms of compute, that it's not something that we can easily access. It's not something that we can generate. And giving access to the community to that, whether it was official or not, shifted the landscape. And what we were hearing universally was companies saying that they couldn't compete with the pace of adoption in the open communities. This memo is, totally notorious, the Google memo. Now, it came from one individual. It doesn't necessarily represent Google's view, but we have no moat. And what Google's employee was saying is that we cannot protect ourselves using our IP. We cannot build a moat around us that is enough to allow us to monetize our own AI products versus what the community can do. Yes, we can create finesse, but we can't build a financial model based on that finesse. It is not enough. And that was a massive challenge to many companies. Zuckerberg got hauled into the Senate and was questioned by multiple different governments about how this could happen. How could an LLM be leaked? And you can see that leak come through in different legislative and policy discussions as the year goes on. But we wonder how the open communities are going to thrive here. Are they actually going to become the epicenter of AI and LLMs? Now, last June, OpenUK was already working with Meta, and that may surprise you. So I said at the start, we're an open tech organization. We believe in openness. If you cut me in half, it says open source, as I know many of you already know. I've dedicated a huge part of my life and my career to it. But I would rather see something halfway open than closed. I didn't make the decision for OpenUK to be part of this. My board did, because I knew it would be slightly controversial, a lot controversial. And what we did was we engaged with Meta in how they were going to release Llama 2. So you'd had this leak earlier in the year, but you have Zuckerberg talking about how he wants to open this up, how he wants to create an LLM that people can share. And if you were following it in a policy way, as I was, you see him on this tour where he's talking to people like the European Commission, where he's talking to Marguerite Vestager, who's the VP of Digital and has run the antitrust competition piece in Europe for a long time. To me, this is an insight, right? He's talking to Vestager. She's then posting about codes of conduct. Whatever we think is going to happen, there is going to be some restriction. Whether that's a code, whether that's legislation, you know at that point is coming down the line. And inevitably, those restrictions, because they interrupt the free flow, are going to stop this being true open source. And one of the things that we often overlook is the fact that we disclaim liability in our open source licenses. By that, I mean we say we have no liability, but that can only ever be to the extent it's permitted by law, right? So if there's a law, if there's something that governments can enforce, that trumps the license. So I look at this and I think, aha, code of conduct coming down the line from the Europeans, maybe from others. And then in July, you see OpenUK listed, and we were the only open organization in there listed as working with Meta. Now, I had read the license, I'd read the AUP in advance, and the license is called the Llama Community License, and it is not open source, right? Nobody ever suggested it was open source before launch. You'll see when you look at Meta's website, we and the other partners who are involved all talk about open innovation. Because the license has a restriction. It has multiple restrictions, but the key one is when you hit 7 million users, which is a lot of users, when you hit 7 million, you need a commercial license. Now, potentially what that means is that Meta, sitting in the center of this ecosystem, can require you, a successful user who's built your product on it, to come back and have a commercial license, the terms of which are unknown, but also it allows them to control an ecosystem. And that's the piece that stops it being open source to me. You've got your acceptable use and, do no harm, but the real key piece is that commercialization. It doesn't mean that it wasn't a step in the right direction, because without that opening up, we wouldn't be pushing the boundaries, pushing the envelope and getting towards the potential of having real open source. And then, of course, Zuckerberg announces it. And for the first time, it's described as open source. So this is the first time in the history of Llama that unintentional or intentional open washing happened where open source was used. Prior to that, and on their own website, it always says open innovation. Now, you'll see Jan LeCun, the product director, I think his title is VP of Product, also starts to use that. And what starts to happen is we have this friction. We have this conversation about open source AI. We see Alibaba do the same thing. I've already explained to you why I think it's okay, but what's not okay is open washing or faux pen licenses and confusion. So what we need is clarity. And the myth of Llama being open source is a problem. And this is what I think the problem is. And we submitted this in the House of Lords inquiry last year. And if you look at the right-hand side, stage right, your left, you'll see what we think open source software is. It complies with the open source definition. The opposite to us is proprietary, and that could be something like the SSPL, where you have a restriction, or it could be closed source, right? So we think we've got open source and proprietary, but regulators look at this and they see closed and open as being the opposites of each other. And it's very nuanced, but it's absolutely critical to our understanding of what is open source AI, what is open source anything, in fact, and what is not. And one of the things we have to understand about AI is, as of last year, open source is now on the landscape and the agenda. And what that means is, I went to the Labour Party conference last year, and I was at fringe events with people who were describing open source as something that should be banned. And I was sort of thinking about that, and I thought, okay, just do it. I'm not going to argue with you. There's no point, because you clearly don't know what open source is, or you wouldn't be making that suggestion. And when I heard them go further and talk about what open source is, it was becoming something that meant all the bad things in AI. They just didn't know what they were talking about. And it became clear to us that what we have to do is educate. So that's where I came up with these little boxes to try and show policymakers and regulators the disconnect. There's no real definition in there. It's just, here is our disconnect, here is our understanding. And I think it's important to then be seen as looking at the shades of openness, whether it's the Llama restricted licensing, whether it's a true open source LLM like Falcon. Understanding what that means is important, and not legislating for them in the same way. Now, some of you may be aware the OSI is doing something around defining open source AI. They've just come out with version 6 of their definition, but it needs more consultation. I suspect this is too late. I think we are clear on what open source means. We're clear on that definition. as of yesterday, I'll come to it in a minute, but as of yesterday, we have the first piece of law anywhere in the world on AI. The European Parliament approved the AI Act, and it has a definition of open source in it, which doesn't include this. So I think we're a little bit too late. And I really stressed out the organisers, not just because I have ADHD and I'm always late with my slides, but I've been holding out to share the next step in this with you. So Elon has obviously said this week that he's going to open source Grok, but he hasn't actually done it. And what that means is I don't know if it's actually going to be open source or if he's yet another person who's confusing what open source means. Wired did a really interesting article where they go into why open source would be great, and their assumption that what he's meaning by this is that people are going to be able to go in and modify the code, but they don't go as far as saying that that's going to be unrestricted access. And at the same time as I have this 12-month journey where I'm forced to start to try and understand open source and AI and look at models, look at weights, look at data, because of course it's not just software, right? In my head, I have, most of you don't look old enough to know this, but do you know who Pink Floyd are? Right, okay. Do you know Another Brick in the Wall? Right, well, you know the animation. I think of AI as that animation. And the mincemeat machine, for me, is the AI. And then you've got the stuff going in, people there, it's a bit scary, and mince coming out. So for me, the weights, the algorithms, the models are the machine. And they're all different components, whether it's screws or handles or whatever, that are licensed different ways. And then you've got what goes in and what comes out. And if you put something very expensive and high quality in, you're going to get something good out. So, you might put a fillet steak in and get filet mignon. You might put all the scrap of the day in and get sausages or burgers out the other end. But it really comes down to how you use that AI and the data. And that sort of tells us that it's more than just the software. The weights, the models are absolutely critical. And like me, what we're now seeing is policymakers and governments trying to work out what this is all about. How do they regulate it? And the UK has taken what they call a pro-innovation approach to AI. I find myself on a stage yet again saying, I agree with Rishi Sunak. That's something that doesn't happen so often, and hopefully by next year it will have stopped. But he has this vision where he recognizes that we need to bring the world together to look at AI. And I have this sort of secret, not so secret hope, that doing that will demonstrate to policymakers and lawyers and regulators that actually what we need is cross-border legislation or a standard across borders, because the future of tech is actually global and collaborative. And what we don't need is every country in the world with a different set of regulation. He also has a public sector behind him where a lady called Sarah Munby, who is the Parliamentary Private Secretary, a very British thing to be in DCIT, last week said, I don't know. I don't know what the answers are in AI, and I really admired her for that. Because what she's saying is they've got to build understanding before they make laws. They're recognizing the pace of change is something that lawmaking can't keep up with. So I actually think that us having things like the Global Summit here in the UK and taking that steady approach and looking at something that will be agile, looking at something that will be lean is the right approach. And what we're also seeing is UK is pushing out to the regulators. So to Ofcom, to the telco regulator, the finance regulator, the healthcare regulator, making sure that their existing regulations are AI fit. So if you're taking AI and you're using it in a sector, you have to think about the sectorial requirements. And for me, that's the way to deal with it. I can't help stick this in because after the summit, I think he went completely off message because the UK technically has no policy on open source AI. But Oliver Dowden waxed lyrical about the wonders of open source immediately after. And we have sort of practical challenges. If you look at the US, you'll see fair use allows data, text and data mining. And there's 20-odd countries around the world that have also agreed that you can do that in their country. In the UK, we had something called the Valence Report. The Intellectual Property Office are supposed to create a code of conduct on the back of it. They were supposed to give us that last June, then September, then December, and at some point this year. And about 2 weeks ago, they actually pushed it back to DCIT, our Science, Innovation, Technology department, because it's too difficult. And what we've got is a friction between the creative industries, who everybody in this room, I'm sure, want the creative industries to survive, and those training LLMs on data. and this concern about where the money's going to come from. And I suspect that, like software, they need to move away from a royalty model and think about something more creative. We produced our report in January, and we published it on the 1st of February. And on the 2nd of February, there was a draft text for the AI Act, and there was a draft, there wasn't a draft, there was the House of Lords report came out the next day. So we're going to have to do an addendum. And we're quite proud. We're referenced 10 times in the House of Lords report, and we're actually quoted here. And we're quoted talking about these shades of openness. We're quoted talking about how if you regulate true open source in the same way as you'd regulate something like Llama with controls in it, it's like regulating the road. It's like saying a bicycle and an HGV are going to have the same laws applied to them. You know, they're both vehicles, they both get from A to B, but the nuance is so important in the difference between them that we have to think about it. And to me, it's interesting that that's what the House of Lords pulled out of our 12 pages of writing, because what you've got is a lack of understanding of open and people grasping at what they can find to cover that. In the US, we've had an executive order, and the White House is working at pace with specific things to be done by specific deadlines, which is going to be really hard. And the G7, through the Hiroshima process, have got to a code of conduct. But the big thing is MEPs yesterday approving the AI Act, the first piece of legislation anywhere in the world on AI. And it has 4 categories for what the levels of concern around AI are. And there's a high-risk category. And in that high-risk category, there is no exception for open source, even if you don't make any money out of it. And the other 3 categories, there's an exception from complying with the legislation for open source, but not if you make any money. So if you want to eat and you want to be able to have any revenue at all, however you find it, around what you do with the code that you are creating, then you are subject to this law from the AI perspective. It's very similar to the Cyber Resilience Act, which is going to apply to your code in terms of any code that's distributed in Europe. And for me, I think it's a massive concern, because I don't think individual innovators and SMEs are going to have a hope of complying with it. It's exactly what Jimmy Wales was talking about when he said only 8 companies in the world are going to be able to comply easily with the AI Act, because you need a massive compliance team to begin to understand technically and legally how you do that. And what I fear is that what that's going to mean is, at least for Europe, that code going into Europe is a problem. It's a problem because if you're going to make any money out of it, you're going to have these really high levels of liability where you are potentially unable to buy insurance, and compliance is going to be really tricky. You're probably going to have to get consultants in to work out how to do that. And you're not going to be able to do it. And what that, for me, will mean is that for Europe, you're going to go back to systems integrators and lock-in, which we've spent 20 years trying to shift away from. So I think in many ways it's a bit misguided, because we just don't understand how the ecosystem works in making this legislation. There's a number of decent articles already on it. And what does that mean for AI and for open source? How does AI impact open source? How does open source impact AI? Well, this is a little quote from the House of Lords, who recognise that there is a range of different kinds of AI and LLMs, some of it open, some of it closed. I think that's a good thing, and they recognise the benefits of each. When we think about the downside of closed, what we see is single points of failure and concentrated market power. 30 years ago, when I first started working in tech, I couldn't have imagined a tech landscape like we have today. And I don't believe that regulators and policymakers would have wished for it. I don't believe having a few companies as the center of power and a few individuals behind them was their intent. I don't believe today they want that to happen with AI, and they're going to have to make some very different decisions if they don't want that to happen and for AI to be truly open. We saw the risks of closed AI when Sam Altman was doing the hokey cokey around being in and out of OpenAI. One day he was CEO, the next day he wasn't, a couple of days later he was back. And what that did was it created panic across their customers. It also had a massive impact on Microsoft's share price, but it had a massive impact on OpenAI's customers. And that's part of the danger of closed source around AI. When we look at the models for open sourcing it, we see clear benefits. We see the democratization of technology, we see opening up innovation, allowing further innovation. And frankly, for anybody in the UK or Europe, If you want to be able to access the best technology coming out in AI, it is not currently being developed here. The UK is supposed to be third in the marketplace. That must be a massive drop behind the US and China. You know, something like 96% of AI compute is in the US and China. So we really have to think about our place in the future if we want to consider closing AI and the benefits of opening it. So, back to my initial question, almost exactly on time, I know. Is AI going to kill open source? Now, there were two ladies at the beginning who said yes. I'm curious about the audience's view. What do you reckon? Is AI going to kill open source? You've changed your mind. Interesting. Well, I think maybe exactly is the answer. And it really depends on decisions that are made now and in the next few months and in the very short term, next year or two, by regulators, by policymakers. But I think what we all have as a community to do is to go back to things like our Open Manifesto here in the UK. I'm sure you'll see equivalents around the world as different elections happen, and make sure that our governments, make sure that our legislators understand the value of open source, that it's not purely something that's focused on AI and that's part of a bigger ecosystem. Thank you all very much for your patience, and I think I'm now between you and drinks.